The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the vast Texas landscape bathed in darkness. The only source of light came from the headlights of James Carter's truck as he drove down an endless stretch of highway. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale against the black leather. He had been driving for hours, but the road stretched on, empty and silent, except for the occasional sign pointing toward towns he'd never heard of. James was on his way to California, chasing a fresh start after a string of bad decisions back home in Tennessee. His job, his girlfriend, even his family, he'd left it all behind. A change of scenery, he told himself, would fix things. But as the night wore on and exhaustion settled into his bones, he began to feel the weight of isolation creeping in. The highway was deserted, and James hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour. His truck's engine hummed steadily, a constant reminder that he was still moving forward. The radio crackled with static before he gave up and shut it off entirely. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. He rolled down the window slightly, letting the cool night air rush in, but it didn't help ease the strange feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't until he passed an old, faded sign reading, "Red Pines, 12 miles, that James realized how tired he really was. He'd never heard of Red Pines before, but the idea of a place to rest, even for a short while, was too tempting to ignore. With a tired sigh, he flipped on his blinker and turned onto the exit ramp. The road leading into town was narrow and lined with tall, swaying pines that cast long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. The town itself seemed frozen in time, quaint old buildings with peeling paint, a gas station with flickering neon lights, and a diner that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. James slowed the truck, peering through the windshield as he took in the eerie stillness. Pulling into the diner's gravel lot, he shut off the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the darkened windows. A single neon sign in the window buzzed faintly, spelling out "Open" in tired red letters. He considered driving on, but his stomach growled in protest, and the idea of a hot meal was too good to pass up. James stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing in the night. He pushed open the diner's door, and the bell above it jingled softly. Inside, the place smelled of old grease and burnt coffee. The waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from her lips, barely glanced up from her crossword puzzle. "Help you?" she asked in a voice rough from years of smoking. "Just a coffee and maybe a burger," James replied, sliding onto a stool. As the waitress shuffled off to the kitchen, James glanced around. The place was empty except for a lone man sitting in the far booth, his eyes locked onto James with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. James ignored the man and turned his attention to the window. Outside, the town seemed even quieter than before. A single street lamp flickered, casting long shadows down the empty road. Something about this place felt off. When the waitress returned with his food, James leaned in and asked, "This town always this quiet?" She gave him a look, then glanced at the clock above the door. "People don't stay out late around here." James frowned. "Why's that?" She simply shrugged. "Best to eat your food and get some rest, stranger." As James took a bite of his burger, a nagging feeling crept up his spine. Something told him that stopping in Red Pines might have been the worst decision he'd made yet. James chewed his burger slowly, the dry meat and stale bun doing little to satisfy his hunger. The distant hum of an overhead fan mixed with the occasional clatter of utensils from the kitchen, but otherwise, the diner remained eerily quiet. He could still feel the stranger's eyes on him from across the room, and it took everything in him not to glance over again. The man sat in the farthest booth, his face partially obscured by the dim lighting. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a trucker cap pulled low over his forehead. He wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, just sitting there, watching. James cleared his throat and forced himself to focus on the waitress instead. She stood behind the counter, flipping through a well-worn magazine, her expression one of complete disinterest. He wondered how long she'd been working here, how many travelers she'd seen come and go. Taking a sip of the bitter coffee, James finally turned his head slightly, sneaking a quick glance toward the stranger. Their eyes met, cold, unblinking. The man's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile before he slowly stood up. Without a word, he walked to the door and pushed it open, stepping into the night. The bell jingled softly behind him, and the door creaked shut. James exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. He wasn't sure why the guy had gotten under his skin so much. Maybe it was the late hour, the exhaustion creeping in, or the unsettling quiet of the town itself. The waitress smirked slightly, catching his unease. "Don't mind him," she said, not looking up from her magazine. "He's just curious about outsiders." "Friendly town you've got here," James muttered, forcing a chuckle. She shrugged. "We don't get many visitors." "Not since the accident." James raised an eyebrow. "Accident?" The waitress shot him a look, as if realizing she'd said too much. She hesitated for a moment, then turned back to her magazine. "Just eat your food, honey." James frowned but didn't push further. He finished his burger in silence, feeling the weight of the empty diner pressing in around him. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. When he finally stood to pay, he dug into his wallet and placed a crumpled 20 on the counter. The waitress took it without a word, sliding him his change with a practiced hand. "Where's the nearest motel?" James asked. "Down the road, past the gas station," she replied. "Only one in town. You'll see it." James nodded and turned to leave, but as he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Lock your doors," she said without looking up. "And don't go looking around too much." A chill ran down his spine. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but something in her expression told him he wouldn't like the answer. Outside, the town was silent. The street lamp flickered weakly, and the shadows beneath the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally long. James climbed into his truck, locking the doors as the waitress had suggested. He pulled out of the lot, following the cracked asphalt road toward the motel. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating empty storefronts and faded signs. There was something unsettling about Red Pines, something that gnawed at the edge of his mind, whispering that he should leave while he still could. As he approached the small, run-down motel, James spotted something in the rearview mirror. The man from the diner. Standing under the street lamp, watching him. James swallowed hard and pulled into the motel's parking lot, telling himself it was just a coincidence. Just some weird, small-town guy with nothing better to do. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The Red Pines Motel was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1970s. Faded orange neon flickered above the front office, casting an eerie glow across the cracked parking lot. The sign read "Vacancy," though James doubted it had been full in a long time. He parked near the entrance, killing the engine and sitting there for a moment, staring at the peeling paint on the office door. He could still see the man from the diner standing under the street lamp in his rearview mirror, motionless, as if waiting for something. The unease in James's chest tightened, but he forced himself to shake it off. "This town's just weird, that's all," he muttered to himself, stepping out of the truck and heading inside. The motel's front office was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old carpet and stale cigarettes. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his wrinkled face illuminated by the glow of a dusty desk lamp. He barely looked up from the newspaper spread before him. "Need a room?" the man asked in a gravelly voice. "Yeah, just for the night," James replied, pulling out his wallet. "What's the rate?" $40. Cash. James hesitated. "No cards?" The old man looked up then, his tired eyes locking onto James with a strange intensity. "Cash only." James nodded slowly and handed over the bills. The old man took them without counting, then reached under the counter and slid a tarnished brass key across the scratched surface. "Room 6, he said. "Round the side." James took the key, noting the number stamped on the rusted tag. "Thanks." "Checkout's at 8, the man added as James turned to leave. "Don't be late." James paused, glancing back. "What happens if I am?" The old man just smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Wouldn't know. No one's ever stayed past 8. James swallowed and pushed the door open, stepping back into the cool night air. The distant hum of insects buzzed in the darkness, but the town itself was silent. He glanced toward the street lamp again. The man was gone. Shaking off the creeping feeling of unease, James walked along the row of motel rooms, counting the doors until he found number 6. The key scraped in the lock before it turned with a reluctant click. The door creaked open, revealing a dim, musty room with faded floral wallpaper and a stained carpet. A single lamp on the nightstand cast weak yellow light over the bed, its mattress sagging in the middle. James sighed, closing the door behind him and bolting it shut. Tossing his duffel bag onto the bed, he sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. As he leaned back against the headboard, his eyes drifted to the window. The heavy curtains were partially open, and through the thin gap, he could see the parking lot outside. Then he froze. A figure stood at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering neon. It was the man from the diner. Standing perfectly still, staring at James's window. James's pulse quickened. He reached for the curtain, yanking it closed in one swift motion. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding, listening to the eerie silence pressing in from outside. Maybe he was just imagining things. Maybe it was exhaustion. Deciding not to overthink it, James kicked off his boots and lay down, staring at the ceiling. He told himself he just needed a few hours of sleep, and he'd be gone by morning. But as his eyes grew heavy, a distant sound reached his ears, faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside his door. James lay frozen on the sagging motel bed, his breath shallow and his heart hammering in his chest. The footsteps outside his door were slow, almost deliberate, each one crunching softly against the gravel, stopping just long enough to send a fresh wave of dread crawling up his spine. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the window, now hidden behind the heavy curtains. A part of him wanted to peek out, to confirm whether the figure from the parking lot was still out there. But something deep in his gut told him not to. Instead, he reached slowly for his duffel bag at the foot of the bed, pulling it toward him as quietly as possible. Inside, buried beneath a few changes of clothes, was his old hunting knife. His fingers closed around the worn handle, and he exhaled softly, feeling a little more in control. The footsteps stopped. James held his breath, straining to hear anything beyond the thin motel walls. He counted the seconds in his head, but all he could hear was the distant hum of the motel sign and the occasional creak of the old building settling around him. Then, a shadow passed beneath the door. A sliver of dim light from the parking lot seeped in, and James could see the unmistakable shape of 2 feet standing motionless outside his room. Whoever it was, they weren't moving anymore. They were just standing there. James gripped the knife tighter, weighing his options. He could throw open the door and confront whoever was outside, or he could wait them out. Neither choice felt particularly good. A soft, deliberate tap on the door made him jump. It wasn't loud, just a single, measured knock. James's mouth went dry. He sat up slowly, his eyes locked on the doorknob. It didn't turn, but something about the silence that followed made the room feel smaller, the air heavier. Another knock. James took a deep breath and forced himself to speak. "Who is it?" No answer. The tension in his muscles grew unbearable. "I'm not looking for trouble, man," he said, his voice firmer now. I just needed a place to crash. Still nothing. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow beneath the door shifted. The figure outside moved, but instead of retreating, James could hear it walking slowly, dragging footsteps now, down the length of the motel's corridor. He listened intently as the sound faded, eventually disappearing altogether. For several minutes, James didn't move. He sat there, knife in hand, staring at the door. Finally, with a shaky breath, he got up and crept to the window, pushing the curtain aside just a fraction of an inch. The parking lot was empty. James let the curtain fall back into place and sat down on the edge of the bed, running a hand over his face. This town, he muttered under his breath, is seriously messed up. He decided then and there, he'd catch a few hours of sleep, but at the first sign of daylight, he was leaving Red Pines. No breakfast, no sightseeing, just the open road and as much distance as possible between him and this place. Lying back down, he kept the knife on the nightstand within easy reach, listening carefully to the quiet. But even as exhaustion pulled him under, one thought lingered at the back of his mind. Whoever had been outside his door, had they really left? Or were they just waiting? James woke with a start. His eyes shot to the clock on the nightstand, 3:12 a.m. The motel room was steeped in darkness, the weak glow of the neon sign outside barely piercing through the thick curtains. For a moment, he didn't know what had woken him. Then he heard it. A soft creak. His pulse quickened. It wasn't coming from outside this time. The sound was inside the room. James held his breath, gripping the hunting knife he'd left beside him. He stayed perfectly still, listening. His ears strained against the silence, and after a moment, he heard it again, another creak, closer this time. His eyes adjusted to the dark, scanning the room. The door was still bolted shut. The window was locked. But something felt wrong. The air was heavier, and a faint metallic scent hung in the room, like rust or old pennies. Moving slowly, James sat up, his fingers tightening around the knife's handle. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and low. No response. He slid off the bed quietly, his bare feet pressing into the stained carpet. Step by step, he moved toward the light switch by the door. The floor groaned beneath him, and he winced. Just as his hand reached the switch, he heard it again, this time right behind him. James spun around, flicking the light on in one frantic motion. The room was empty. His chest heaved with shallow breaths as he scanned every inch of the small space. The closet door was slightly ajar, just as he'd left it. The bathroom door was closed. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. James rubbed a hand over his face, his nerves frayed. "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath. Maybe it was the exhaustion catching up with him, or the paranoia that had been building since he rolled into this town. Either way, he wasn't about to sit in the dark and let it get to him. Leaving the light on, he moved to the bathroom, flipping that switch as well. The small, dingy space looked normal, yellow tiles, a rust-stained sink, and a cracked mirror above it. He turned the faucet on and splashed cold water on his face, trying to steady himself. As he looked up into the mirror, something outside the bathroom caught his eye. Through the reflection, James saw the closet door, slowly swinging open. He whipped around, his heart slamming against his ribs. The door creaked to a stop, revealing the black void inside. James stood frozen, the knife held tight in his grip. Then, a faint whisper drifted from the closet's darkness. "Leave." James didn't hesitate. He bolted forward, grabbing his duffel bag off the bed and yanking the motel door open. The cold night air rushed in as he stumbled out into the parking lot, looking around wildly. The lot was empty, the quiet town stretching before him under the flickering streetlights. Slamming the door shut behind him, James ran to his truck, fumbling with the keys. His hands shook as he jammed them into the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. Without a second thought, he peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. In the rearview mirror, the motel faded into the darkness, but James swore he saw someone, standing in the window of his room, watching him leave. He didn't stop driving until he was miles down the highway, the town of Red Pines swallowed by the night behind him. But even as he sped away, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. James kept his foot pressed hard against the gas pedal, the needle on the speedometer hovering dangerously close to 90. The empty highway stretched endlessly before him, swallowed by darkness on all sides. He flicked nervous glances into the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see headlights, or worse, that shadowy figure, from the motel following him. But the road behind him remained empty. His heart pounded in his chest, his grip tight around the steering wheel. He tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he was just exhausted, his mind playing tricks on him after too many miles on the road. But deep down, he knew better. The whisper in the closet, the creeping sense of being watched, those things were real. James swallowed hard and forced his focus back onto the road. He had to get as far from Red Pines as possible. After nearly an hour of driving, he spotted a sign ahead, next gas, 2 miles. His fuel gauge hovered near empty, the stress of the night making him forget how low it had been. With a deep breath, he eased off the accelerator. He needed gas, and maybe some coffee, anything to clear his head. The gas station sat on the side of the highway, a lone island of flickering fluorescent light in the vast darkness. It was one of those 24-hour spots, the kind with outdated pumps and a convenience store packed with junk food and bad coffee. James pulled in, his tires crunching over gravel. As he stepped out of the truck, the cool night air sent a shiver down his spine. He looked around, scanning the lot. No cars. No other people. Just the buzzing lights and the distant chirp of crickets. He grabbed the pump handle and started filling up, his eyes darting around the empty road beyond. The uneasy feeling hadn't left him, lingering like a shadow in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the idea that someone, or something, was still out there, watching. The pump clicked off, and James screwed the cap back on hastily before heading inside. The inside of the store smelled of stale coffee and cleaning chemicals. A bored-looking clerk sat behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine. He barely acknowledged James as he grabbed a cup of coffee and made his way to the register. "That'll be $4.50, the clerk said without looking up. James handed over a crumpled bill and took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, grimacing. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a bulletin board near the entrance, covered in faded flyers and missing person notices. One flyer stood out. It was old, the edges curled and yellowed with age. The grainy photo showed a man in a flannel shirt and trucker cap. James's stomach dropped. It was him. The man from the diner. James stared at the flyer, his mouth dry as he read the words beneath the photo. Missing since 2003. Last seen near Red Pines. A chill crept up his spine. He turned to the clerk, holding up the flyer. "Hey, you know anything about this guy?" The clerk glanced up, then quickly looked away. "Nah, man. People go missing all the time round here." James felt a lump form in his throat. "And they don't come back?" The clerk shrugged. "Not usually." James nodded slowly, backing away from the counter. The air inside the store suddenly felt too thick, too heavy. He pushed through the glass door and hurried back to his truck, his eyes scanning the empty lot. Sliding into the driver's seat, he locked the doors and took another look at the flyer, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes drifted back to the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold. The man in the flannel shirt was standing in the darkness beyond the gas station lights, just watching. James didn't hesitate. He threw the truck into gear and sped off down the highway, his heart slamming against his ribs. The gas station disappeared into the night, but that nagging, gnawing fear remained. No matter how fast he drove, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. And deep down, he knew Red Pines wasn't done with him yet. James drove, the empty highway stretching endlessly before him, but something felt off. The further he went, the more the road started to look the same, mile after mile of cracked asphalt, the same weathered signs, and the same twisted silhouettes of trees lining the shoulder. He glanced down at his dashboard. The fuel gauge, which should have been near full after his stop, was already dipping lower than it should be. He frowned, tapping the glass. "Come on, not now," he muttered. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. Nothing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the glow of his taillights, lurking in the pitch-black night. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. The GPS on his phone had lost signal miles ago, leaving him alone with only the occasional road sign to reassure him he was going the right way. Next town, 10 miles, a faded green sign read. James exhaled in relief. Just a little further. But as he pressed on, another sign appeared not 5 minutes later. Next town, 10 miles. James frowned, rubbing his eyes. Maybe he misread it. He kept driving. 20 minutes later, the same sign appeared again. His knuckles widened around the wheel. This isn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as a thought crept into his mind. What if he hadn't actually left Red Pines? What if the town wasn't done with him yet? Slowing the truck, James pulled over to the side of the road. The engine idled loudly in the still night, the headlights illuminating the empty stretch ahead. He reached for his phone, but it still showed no service. He sighed and leaned back in his seat, gripping the bridge of his nose. Think, James. Think. Then, a new sound broke the silence. Soft. Distant. Footsteps. His head snapped up. Out there, just beyond the reach of his headlights, a figure stood at the edge of the road. James's stomach dropped. It was him again. The man in the flannel shirt and trucker cap. He wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching. James's breathing grew ragged. He slammed the truck into reverse, tires skidding on the gravel as he pulled a hard U-turn, gunning it in the opposite direction. He drove for miles, his eyes darting between the road and the mirror. No sign of the man. No sign of anything. It was just him and the empty highway. Then he saw it again. Next town, 10 miles. James felt ice creep through his veins. He slammed his fist against the dashboard. No. No, no, no. His headlights flickered for a brief moment, and when they stabilized, his heart nearly stopped. The man in the flannel shirt was standing in the middle of the road. James barely had time to react. He jerked the wheel violently, swerving to avoid him. The truck skidded off the road, tires biting into the dirt shoulder before he regained control and came to a stop. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. Slowly, he turned his head back to the road. Nothing. The man was gone. James wiped sweat from his brow and forced himself to breathe. He needed to get out of here, but the longer he stayed, the more it felt like Red Pines had wrapped itself around him. Taking a deep breath, he shifted the truck back into gear and pressed on, hoping, praying, that the next time he saw a sign, it wouldn't say, 10 miles, again. James gripped the wheel, his fingers aching from how tightly he'd been holding on. The road stretched ahead, the cracked asphalt lit only by his dimming headlights. He glanced down at the fuel gauge, less than a quarter tank left. His mind raced. How the hell is this happening? He'd filled up at the gas station, hadn't he? The number had been ticking up, or had it? The memory felt hazy now, like a dream. The road sign still haunted him. Next town, 10 miles. They came every few minutes, always the same distance. James swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He was stuck in a loop, and the more he drove, the more it felt like he wasn't getting anywhere. He tapped the phone mounted on his dash again. No service. He had stopped checking after the 10th time, but some part of him hoped. Hoped for anything to break the eerie silence. A flicker of movement in the mirror made his stomach drop. He glanced up, but there was nothing there. Just the dark road disappearing behind him. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he pressed harder on the gas pedal. The truck groaned under the strain, but he didn't care. He needed to get out. Needed to see something, anything, different. Then the radio crackled to life. Static hissed through the speakers, making him jump. His hand shot to the dial, twisting it, but no matter what station he tried, the static remained. And beneath the noise, a voice, soft, whispering. "Turn around." James's breath hitched. He ripped the radio knob off in his panic, silencing the sound instantly. "No," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "Just keep driving." But as he rounded the next bend, his stomach lurched. Headlights. Another vehicle up ahead, pulled over to the side of the road. It was the first sign of life he'd seen in hours. Slowing down cautiously, James approached the car, a battered old sedan, its hood up and steam rising into the night air. He pulled up beside it, lowering his window. A woman stood next to the car, her long dark hair falling in front of her face as she looked up. Her expression was hard to read in the dim light, but there was something unsettling about how still she stood. James hesitated. He wasn't sure if stopping was a good idea, but something about leaving someone stranded out here felt worse. "You need help?" he called out. The woman didn't answer. He swallowed and tried again. "Ma'am? You all right?" Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed behind him. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. He didn't want to turn. Every instinct screamed at him not to look. But something in him, some awful curiosity, forced him to glance into the mirror. His blood ran cold. The man in the flannel shirt was standing directly behind his truck, barely illuminated by the taillights. His face was obscured in shadow, but his posture, rigid, unmoving, sent a wave of nausea through James's gut. He slammed the truck into gear and floored it, tires screeching as he sped past the woman and her stalled car. He didn't care anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't right. The engine roared as he sped down the highway, the woman and her broken-down car disappearing in the rearview mirror. But James didn't feel relief. He felt like he'd made a mistake. The headlights ahead flickered. Another sign came into view. Next town, 10 miles. James let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling. He was trapped. And he was starting to wonder if anyone had ever actually left Red Pines. James could feel his sanity unraveling with every mile. The gas gauge was slipping closer to empty, and despite driving for what felt like hours, he was no closer to getting out of here. The same sign taunted him every time he thought he was making progress. Next town, 10 miles. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and a cold sweat clung to his skin. He tried to think rationally. Turn around. Go back to the gas station. Find someone. But the thought of facing that figure again, the man in the flannel shirt, made his stomach twist. Instead, he kept driving. Soon, the truck began to sputter, the engine coughing like a smoker on his last breath. James cursed under his breath, his eyes darting around for any sign of civilization. And then, as if the town had heard him, he saw it, dim lights flickering through the trees. A diner. James let out a shaky breath and rolled the truck to a stop in the gravel lot. It was the same diner he'd been in hours ago, or maybe longer. The sign above the entrance flickered weakly, Betty's Diner, best pie in town. He sat there for a moment, staring at it, his mind reeling. How? He had driven in the opposite direction. He had been heading away from this place, yet here it was, sitting like a bad dream waiting to pull him back in. His hands shook as he killed the engine and stepped out. The night air felt heavier here, thick with something he couldn't name. The diner's neon lights buzzed loudly in the silence. James pushed open the door, the bell jingling overhead. Inside, the diner was exactly as he'd left it, red leather booths, a long counter lined with stools, and that ever-present smell of burnt coffee and stale grease. But something was wrong. The place was empty. No Betty behind the counter, no old men nursing their cups of coffee. No voices. No clatter of dishes. Just an oppressive silence. James swallowed hard and took a cautious step inside. "Hello." His voice echoed off the tiled walls. A soft scraping sound came from behind the counter. James tensed, his hand drifting toward the knife he still had tucked in his jacket. Then, she appeared. Betty. Her apron stained, her smile a little too wide. "Back so soon?" she asked, wiping an invisible spot off the counter. James stared at her, his mouth dry. I think I'm lost. I keep driving, but I can't seem to get out of town." Betty's smile didn't falter. "Some folks just can't leave, hon." She leaned in a little closer. "Why don't you sit down? Have some pie. You look like you could use it." James shook his head. "I need gas. I need to get out of here." Betty sighed, shaking her head slowly. "You can't leave on an empty stomach." She slid a slice of pie across the counter toward him. "Eat. You'll feel better." James glanced at the pie, and something in his gut twisted. The crust was too perfect, the filling too dark. The smell, it wasn't right. It smelled off. Like something spoiled. He took a step back. I should go." Betty's face darkened. Her smile remained, but her eyes hardened. "Suit yourself, hon." James turned and hurried toward the door, his pulse racing. As his hand gripped the handle, something caught his eye. The booths weren't empty anymore. They were filled with people. Dozens of them. All of them sitting perfectly still, facing forward, their eyes locked onto him. The man in the flannel shirt was among them, his blank stare drilling into James's skull. James stumbled back, his chest heaving. No, 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 no. He bolted out the door, nearly tripping down the steps, and sprinted to his truck. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. The truck roared to life, and he tore out of the lot, gravel kicking up behind him. As he sped away, he dared one last look in the mirror. The diner's sign flickered. The people inside hadn't moved. But Betty. She stood in the doorway, smiling. And she whispered something James couldn't hear. But he didn't have to. He knew what it was. James sped down the highway, his mind racing faster than the truck. The diner's neon lights still burned in his memory, seared into his vision like a bad dream that refused to fade. His fingers trembled on the wheel, knuckles bone white. He drove until the gas needle hovered just above empty, the engine whining in protest. His eyes darted to the road signs, praying for something different. Next town, 10 miles. James let out a shaky laugh, a sound caught between hysteria and exhaustion. No. No, not again. He slammed his fist against the dashboard. I'm not going in circles, I'm not. But he was. The truck sputtered as he pulled over to the shoulder, the engine coughing its last breath. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. Silence. Then, a familiar sound. The crunch of gravel under slow, deliberate footsteps. James froze. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The presence was heavy, suffocating. He gripped the knife in his jacket pocket, his heart thudding in his ears. A tap. His eyes flicked to the driver's side window. The man in the flannel shirt stood just outside, his face still obscured by the darkness. But this time, James saw something new, something worse. The man was holding something. A key. James's breath hitched. "Open the door," the man's voice rasped through the glass. It was dry, cracked, like wind scraping across bone. James shook his head slowly, his hand inching toward the gear shift even though the truck was dead. "Not a chance," he muttered under his breath. The man leaned in closer. "You can't leave, James." James's blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone his name. His hand shot to the door lock, pressing it down even though he knew deep down it wouldn't make a difference. He reached for the keys again, twisting them desperately. The engine groaned, but wouldn't turn over. The man in the flannel shirt remained still, watching, waiting. Then, he tilted his head slightly. "Tired yet?" James felt his vision blur, exhaustion crashing over him in waves. His grip on the knife slackened for a moment, his body heavy, sluggish. "No, stay awake. Stay awake." He pressed his hands against his face, trying to steady himself. When he looked back up, the man was gone. James gasped, his head whipping around. The road was empty, stretching into the darkness once more. He swallowed hard, his pulse racing. He needed to move. Fumbling with the door, he stumbled out of the truck and into the cold night air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying distant whispers he couldn't quite make out. His eyes darted around, scanning the darkened road. Then, headlights appeared in the distance. A pair of them, growing brighter. James's heart leapt. Another car. He stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. "Hey! Help! Stop!" The vehicle, a beat-up pickup truck, slowed, then pulled to a stop beside him. The driver rolled down the window, an older man with tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You all right, son?" James nodded furiously. "Please, I need a ride. My truck, it's dead, and I can't," he trailed off, struggling to find the words to explain. The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the passenger seat. "Hop in." James didn't hesitate. He climbed in, slamming the door shut behind him. The old man put the truck into gear, pulling back onto the road. James exhaled a shaky breath, leaning his head back against the seat. "Thank you. I've been trying to get out of here all night." The old man gave him a sidelong glance. "Out of where, exactly?" James furrowed his brows. "Red Pines." The man's cigarette twitched. He let out a slow breath of smoke, his face unreadable. "Son, there ain't no town called Red Pines out this way." James felt his stomach drop. "What?" "No, The old man shook his head. "Ain't been a town called that for years. Burned down back in '03. Folks just disappeared. Only thing left now is, well, a story." James's throat tightened. "That's not possible. I was just there. The diner, the motel." The old man let out a slow chuckle, tapping ash out the window. "You're not the first one to say that." James's head snapped toward him. "What?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he just kept driving. And as James looked out the window, his heart dropped into his stomach. A sign passed by. "Next town, 10 miles." James's mind was a storm of confusion and dread. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the same as it had been for hours, or maybe days. Time had become a blur. The old man's words echoed in his head, reverberating through his skull like a cruel joke. There ain't no town called Red Pines out this way. It's not possible, James whispered to himself, almost pleading. He stared out the window, hoping, praying that he was hallucinating, that this nightmare would end. But the scenery didn't change. The road still wound through the dark, empty trees, the same stretch of barren highway. The man next to him didn't seem to notice his growing panic. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his cigarette glowing softly in the dark. But James couldn't stop the tremor in his hands or the sweat trickling down his neck. It was real. The town. The diner. The people he had seen. It had all been too real. You're not the first one, the old man had said. There's stories. People disappearing, coming back, getting stuck in that loop. James's chest tightened. What did he mean? What loop? It felt like a weight was pressing down on him, suffocating him with every breath. How long had he been driving? How could he not have realized the signs of this insanity earlier? It wasn't just the gas station signs. It wasn't just the man in the flannel. The town had never let him leave. Where are we going? James asked, his voice hoarse. The old man glanced over, his eyes cold and tired. I'm just taking you where the road ends, son. Can't keep going forever. James's stomach churned. Where the road ends? For the first time, he noticed the truck's headlights reflecting in the side mirror, but something wasn't right. They were getting closer, too close. The feeling of dread slammed into him with the force of a freight train. James whipped his head around, his heart thundering in his chest. The figure from the diner, the man in the flannel shirt, was standing just outside the rear window, watching them. His face was still obscured by the shadow, but James could feel the pressure of his gaze, like a physical force pressing against him. He gasped. Stop the truck. The old man didn't react. He just kept driving. Stop. James scrambled for the door handle, but the truck wasn't slowing down. He looked back again, desperate, and the figure was still there. Slowly, almost methodically, the man began to move toward the truck, his steps deliberately paced. The truck didn't stop. The tires ground against the asphalt, the engine roaring as they picked up speed. James's pulse raced as he twisted in his seat, his hand gripping the edge of the door like a lifeline. He's following us. You have to stop. Please. The old man didn't answer. His grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles pale in the dim light. Then, without warning, he turned sharply. James barely had time to react. The truck veered off the road, tires skidding as the vehicle hit the shoulder, and for a moment, everything went silent. The truck came to a shuddering halt in the middle of a long, dark stretch of road. James's head snapped forward, pain shooting through his neck. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from his mind, but something was wrong. He looked to the side, where the old man had been sitting. The seat was empty. James's heart leapt into his throat. The old man was gone. There was no sign of him. His eyes scanned the empty road. Nothing. No headlights in the distance, no movement. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. Then, something moved. A figure, tall, silhouetted against the distant lights of the truck, emerged from the darkness. James's breath caught in his throat as the man in the flannel shirt stepped forward, slowly approaching the truck. His movements were stiff, deliberate, like a puppet on invisible strings. James scrambled to unlock the door. His hands were shaking too much. He couldn't find the handle. The man was almost at the truck now. James's blood ran cold as he realized the figure wasn't walking, he was gliding. The pavement beneath his feet barely seemed to affect his movement. James's pulse thundered in his ears as his body finally reacted. He yanked the door open, spilling out onto the gravel, his legs unsteady beneath him. He looked back, expecting to see the man following him, but the figure had stopped at the truck. He was standing still again, just watching. And then, the man spoke. "Some folks don't get to leave," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. James's heart shattered. This was it. He was never leaving. The reality of it hit him like a blow to the chest. He could run, scream, fight, but none of it would matter. The town, the people, the man in the flannel shirt, they wouldn't let him go. "Get back in the truck." The voice was colder now, almost mechanical. James turned and bolted down the road, faster than he had ever run in his life. His legs screamed for mercy, but he couldn't stop. He had to get away, had to. A sound behind him made him freeze. It wasn't the truck starting. It wasn't the crunch of gravel. It was the sound of footsteps, matching his pace, a soft, deliberate echo following every step. And then, the man's voice, cutting through the still night. "You'll come back. They always do." James's legs burned, his chest heaving as he ran, but the footsteps kept coming. They echoed in the distance, growing steadily louder, moving closer. His heart hammered in his chest, a wild, erratic rhythm that pushed him harder, faster. "I have to get out. I can't go back. I can't." He didn't know how much further he could go. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his legs barely keeping him upright as the sound of those steps behind him seemed to grow in intensity. He dared a glance over his shoulder, and for a split second, his vision blurred, then he saw it. The figure. The man in the flannel shirt. He was running now, gliding effortlessly behind James, his pace unnatural, smooth, and unyielding. The man's face was still obscured, but his eyes, they glowed faintly in the darkness, two bright points of light, focused solely on James. The fear that gripped James's chest intensified, and he stumbled forward, tripping over his own feet. He hit the ground with a jarring thud, the cold earth scraping against his palms. The gravel dug into his knees as he scrambled to get up, panic clouding his mind. His breath came in gasps, his body aching from exhaustion, but still, the footsteps didn't stop. "You'll come back," the voice echoed again, almost too soft to be real, as if the man's words were carried on the wind. "They always do." James's pulse raced, and he pushed himself to his feet, refusing to let himself fall again. He couldn't. If he stopped now, it would be over. The road ahead seemed endless, an unforgiving stretch of blacktop leading into an abyss he had no hope of escaping. And yet, he ran. The footsteps continued, relentless. He didn't know how long he had been running, minutes. Hours. It didn't matter. He was too far gone to think about anything other than getting away. But no matter how fast he moved, how far he pushed himself, the man in the flannel was always there, just a few steps behind. Suddenly, the road ahead seemed to warp, the familiar surroundings fading into something wrong. The trees that lined the highway were twisted, gnarled, almost like skeletal hands reaching out to grab him. The pavement beneath him cracked, lines splitting open like the earth itself was tearing apart. And then, he saw it. The sign. The same sign he had seen before. "Next town, 10 miles. James stopped dead in his tracks. It couldn't be. This was impossible. No. Not again. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. The town, it was pulling him back. The road was a loop, a cycle he couldn't escape. His mind reeled. He had thought he had gotten away, thought he had broken free, but it was all a lie. The town was waiting for him. The man's voice reached him again, low and haunting, barely above a whisper. "I told you. James turned around. The figure in the flannel shirt was standing right behind him now, just a few feet away. This time, his face was visible. The man's expression was empty, hollow, his eyes gleaming with a cold, inhuman light. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at James like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, in the space between heartbeats, the air seemed to shift. The road ahead became something else entirely, an endless loop, a place that didn't belong in the real world. It stretched on, twisting back into itself, folding over, and over. The road he had been running down was now the same road that led back to where he started. James's mind shattered. No, he gasped, stepping back, shaking his head furiously. No, 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 this can't be happening. But the man in the flannel didn't say anything else. He simply watched, his gaze unwavering. And then, with a final, chilling whisper, the man spoke. "Welcome home, James." The world around him went black. When James woke up, he was back in the truck. The engine purred softly, idling on the side of the road. His hands were still gripping the wheel, his breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. The gas gauge was still on empty, the road signs still showing that same, maddening distance. He wasn't sure if he had ever left. The diner, the people, the town, they were all still there, waiting for him. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of reality pressing down on him with unbearable force. The figure in the flannel shirt was gone. But James knew, deep in his bones, that he hadn't truly escaped. He had only run in circles. And the loop had started all over again.